Hey everyone, today we're diving into something that feels totally alien to most of us in the modern world, but was completely normal for our ancestors: eating insect larvae. Those squirmy grubs from beetles, moths, bees, and flies weren't occasional snacks. They were a dietary staple that provided reliable nutrition when bigger game was scarce or dangerous to hunt. In a world without grocery stores or refrigerators, these tiny creatures offered something priceless: easy access to fats, proteins, and essential nutrients that fueled our evolution. This isn't just ancient history trivia. Understanding why our forebears reached for larvae helps explain everything from human brain growth to why so many cultures around the world still eat insects today. And with the way our global food system is straining under climate change and population growth, those old habits might hold lessons for our future. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's travel back in time and see how this all began. Picture this: millions of years ago, long before Homo sapiens walked the earth, our early hominin relatives like Australopithecus were living in forests and woodlands across Africa. These weren't the big game hunters we often imagine. They were opportunistic foragers, much like chimpanzees today. And insects, especially the larvae tucked away in safe, nutrient-rich hiding spots, were low-hanging fruit, literally. Archaeological clues, including wear marks on bone tools, suggest these early ancestors were fishing termites out of mounds or cracking open logs for fat grubs. Termite larvae and pupae are packed with calories. One study even points to how consuming bee larvae might explain certain vitamin excesses in Homo erectus fossils. These weren't random bites. They were strategic. Larvae are basically nature's protein packets, often loaded with more fat than lean meat from a fresh kill. In an era when hunting large animals was risky and not always successful, larvae offered a dependable backup. Think about the daily grind for these early humans. Days spent walking miles in search of food, constantly scanning for threats from predators. A big antelope might provide a feast, but it could take hours or days to track and bring down, and there was always the risk of injury or failure. Larvae? You could find them under bark, in palm trees, or in the soil with minimal effort. No weapons required at first. Just keen eyes and clever hands. This accessibility made them a cornerstone of the diet, filling nutritional gaps that fruits and leaves alone couldn't cover. But here's where it gets really interesting. Scientists believe this steady intake of insect larvae played a key role in one of the most dramatic changes in human evolution: our expanding brains. Brains are incredibly expensive organs to run. They demand high-quality energy and specific building blocks like fats and certain micronutrients. Early hominins shifting toward more reliable sources of these, including fatty larvae, may have given them the caloric surplus needed for bigger, more complex brains. Digging for grubs even encouraged problem-solving and tool use. Imagine figuring out the best way to probe a termite mound with a stick or smash open a log just right. Those small innovations built the cognitive foundation for later tool-making and hunting strategies. Now, fast forward a bit to our more direct ancestors, like Homo erectus and eventually Neanderthals. By this point, fire was in the picture, and hunting had become more sophisticated. But larvae didn't disappear from the menu. If anything, they complemented the bigger meals. Neanderthals, for example, likely dealt with a lot of scavenged or stored meat that wasn't always fresh. In those conditions, flies would lay eggs, hatching into maggots that fed on the meat. Far from being off-putting, those larvae were turning lean, tough game into a richer, more complete food source by adding fats and partially breaking down the proteins. Eating the meat along with the maggots gave them a balanced nutritional punch that pure lean muscle couldn't provide. This wasn't gross to them. It was practical. In a world without salt or curing methods, this natural process helped maximize every calorie from a kill. Recent research even suggests maggot-rich meals were a regular part of Neanderthal life for hundreds of thousands of years. But that's not even the strangest part. Some of these larvae were delicacies in their own right, not just backups. Let's travel to different corners of the ancient world to see how this played out. In Africa, where our species originated, communities have long harvested mopane worms, the larvae of emperor moths. These fat caterpillars feast on mopane tree leaves and become seasonal superfoods. Harvested by the millions, they're boiled, dried, or fried. They're so nutrient-dense that they provide essential protein and fats during times when other foods are limited. Similar practices continue today among indigenous groups, but the tradition stretches back tens of thousands of years. Over in Australia, Aboriginal peoples developed sophisticated ways to manage and harvest witchetty grubs, large-mouthed larvae found in the roots of certain trees or bushes. These grubs were a prized source of sustenance in arid landscapes. Creamy, nutty, and high in energy, they could be eaten raw or cooked. The knowledge of where and when to find them was passed down through generations, turning what looks like random foraging into a reliable system. In the Americas, native peoples enjoyed a variety of larvae too. In Mexico and parts of Central America, certain beetle or skipper larvae were delicacies. Along lockshores, pupae of shore flies were gathered in huge quantities. In South America, palm weevil larvae, known as suri in some regions, are still considered a treat. Creamy and rich, they are often eaten roasted or even raw by indigenous groups who understand their value as a complete food. Even in Europe and Asia, ancient texts mention larvae. Aristotle wrote about the ideal time to harvest cicada larvae, praising their taste. Romans enjoyed beetle larvae fattened in jars with flour and wine. The Bible references locusts, which are essentially the adult form, but the larval stages of various insects were part of many traditional diets. John the Baptist famously survived on locusts and honey in the desert. These weren't fringe habits. They were integrated into life across continents. What made larvae so appealing beyond nutrition? Availability and sustainability. Insects reproduce quickly and thrive in diverse environments. A single tree or log could yield hundreds of grubs without destroying the ecosystem. Compare that to hunting a large animal that might take days and provide meat that spoils fast. Larvae could be gathered by children or elders, freeing up stronger hunters for bigger tasks. They required almost no processing at first, though later cultures developed ways to roast, grind, or mix them into other foods for better flavor and storage. Psychologically, this makes a lot of sense too. Humans are wired for efficiency. In evolutionary terms, we seek out calorie-dense foods that don't demand too much risk or energy. Larvae check every box: high reward, low effort. Over time, this shaped not just our bodies but our tastes and behaviors. Even today, the creamy texture and mild, nutty flavors of many grubs appeal to people in cultures where they're traditional. It's not weird. It's heritage. But what happened as societies changed? As agriculture took hold around 12,000 years ago, diets shifted toward grains and domesticated animals. In many places, especially in Europe and parts of Asia, insect eating became less common or was associated with poorer times. Big livestock provided status and reliable meat, and cultural taboos grew around creepy crawlies. Yet in many tropical and Asia, ancient texts mention larvae. Aristotle wrote about the ideal time to harvest cicada larvae, praising their taste. Romans enjoyed beetle larvae fattened in jars with flour and wine. The Bible references locusts, which are essentially the adult form, but the larval stages of various insects were part of many traditional diets. John the Baptist famously survived on locusts and honey in the desert.